So good morning, good afternoon, bon appétit, everyone. My name is Jean Fouré, and I am pleased to chair this session on baseline development. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this year's GTAP conference, because this is one of the first sessions. So today, Angel Aguiar from the Center for Global Trade Analysis is hosting and recording today's session and will help ensure we keep to our allotted time. Before getting to the presentations, please allow me to remind everyone of the following session protocol and etiquette so that the session runs smoothly. So we recommend that all attendees, excepted the person currently speaking, must remain muted. And during the session, unless otherwise noted, the presentation will last 20 minutes. I guess it will be 20 minutes for a session. The session host, so Angel, will verbally prompt the presenter when there is a 2 minutes remaining to their allotted time. We then allotted presentation. Once the allotted time is elapsed, we have time for a discussion, which will follow immediately for around 10 minutes. So it is preferable for you to put the questions in the chat, but it's also possible for you to raise your hand, your virtual hand, to interact directly. So following the final presentation, we'll have a few minutes, like 2 minutes of transition to allow the next presenter to prepare his or her presentation. So during this session on baseline development, we will have 4 presenters. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to our first speaker, my colleague Rob Dellink from the OECD, who will be presenting his ongoing work on updating the economic drivers of the SSPs. So Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean. Let me share my screen. There you go. So yeah, this is joint work that I've been doing with Laura Atterudi, who's also here in this meeting, Ruben Bibas, Jean, you're also a co-author of this work, and Elisa Lanzi. So this is a project that we're doing, which is updating the economic projections of the shared socioeconomic pathways. And I think you must have been living under a rock if you don't know what the shared socioeconomic pathways are. But for those few people that don't know it, these are socioeconomic scenarios that were made around 10 years ago and that were the successor of the old SRES scenario. So basically, these are first and foremost emission scenarios, and emission scenarios that feed into climate models to then come up with possible future developments of climate change in baseline settings. But the socioeconomic drivers of those, so the education, the population, and the GDP projections have actually been used quite widely also beyond that. I've seen references to it in biodiversity literature, in economic literature, etc. So we have quite a few people that are using these because there are not too many standardized baseline scenarios out there. And this is done at the country level. So basically what we're trying to do now is realizing that 10 years is a long time, and there has been a lot that has happened between then and now that gives cause for updating these scenarios. First of all, there have been demographic developments. Now I'll go into that a little bit more later. Secondly, 10 years ago, we still felt that trade was a major leading driver of economic growth. And the last 10 years have learned that actually it doesn't have to be that way, because there have been several years where actually trade has not grown as fast as GDP. So we have to revisit this kind of trade as an engine of growth scenario again. Thirdly, we had volatility of resource prices, which affect tremendously the GDP projections in African countries, especially, that rely a lot on exporting primary resources. And fourth, last but not least, we had a COVID-19 pandemic, and now we have a Ukraine war. And these are major shocks that affect all these drivers, and that will affect these drivers also in the foreseeable future. So the objective then of this analysis of this paper that I'm presenting today is to update each of these SSP scenarios for gross domestic product by revisiting the underlying key assumptions, the numerical assumptions, but not the storylines. This is not completely new scenarios. This is what have we learned in terms of data, what have we learned in terms of how the economy works, how demography works, etc., and basically trying to build as good as possible new scenarios that are consistent with the original storylines of the SSPs. So this is an update scenario rather than new scenarios. But we're not only looking at putting in new data for the last 10 years and then keeping all the growth rates identical. No, we're really rerunning the model and updating all the drivers underlying the projections so that we get new projections. So the relative comparison across SSPs and the relative comparison across countries does change over time. For example, because we're shifting to a new base year, that the GDP deflator has changed over time, exchange rates shift over time, and this already causes a change in the levels of GDP across different countries. So very briefly, what are these SSPs? SSP2 is the intermediate scenario where you have intermediate challenges to climate change. Then there's an SSP1 with low challenges, an SSP3 with high challenges, SSP4 with adaptation challenges dominating, and SSP5 with mitigation challenges dominating. Now, this doesn't map one-on-one on economic projections. For economic projections, we could say SSP2, the intermediate case, has indeed intermediate economic growth, and it's fairly close to what I would normally call a baseline. SSP1 has higher economic growth, SSP5 has very high economic growth, whereas SSP3 has low economic growth and SSP4 uneven economic growth. So you see that there are differences in the growth, but also in the speed of convergence, the speed of technology development, etc., across the SSPs. I should warn you beforehand, we don't have the projections yet for all the SSPs, so I'm going to, in my results section, only talk about SSP2 for the moment, and we're going to spend the coming weeks identifying the other SSP scenarios. So very briefly, it actually took 10 years before the discussion of starting new scenario work in 2007 until the publication of all these scenarios in 2017. So there was a 10-year already between identifying that we needed new scenarios and actually presenting the new scenarios. Also, we did the analysis of the GDP projections in 2012. These were published in 2017, so that's almost a 5-year gap. And they're used now in the latest IPCC report. So that's a 10-year gap basically between when we produced our GDP projections and the IPCC scenario, the IPCC report that uses these scenarios for climate change analysis. So the time frame for developing scenarios is quite long, and our GDP projections are now basically 10 years old. So therefore, now is a good time to do new projections. So very briefly on the methodology of how we generate these GDP projections. First driver of GDP that we have in the model is total factor productivity, and that consists of two parts. One is convergence of a country towards its frontier, and secondly, the development of the TFP frontier itself. I'll get back to that in a moment. Second one, we have investment leading to capital accumulation. We have labor in two parts. We have employment, the sort of standard labor supply, basically, and we have human capital, which builds on mean years of schooling and education information to build up a human capital development that then increases the efficiency of labor in production. We have something on energy demand, although it doesn't play a very big role in our projections, but it relies on basically the share of energy in GDP. And last but not least, for a number of countries, we have what we call a natural resource value added. And this is basically the resource rents that that countries get from exporting their natural resources. Now, in the current version, we only have oil and gas. So it's basically the fossil fuel exporter that if they have production values that are below the global market price, they can sell, they can export their fossil fuels at a profit margin, and that adds to their GDP. We want to extend this last part also to look at other resources, but we haven't had the time to do that yet. And I'm not entirely sure that we will be able to do that for this round. But this is clearly something that needs to be worked on in the future. So very typically, a country that is already at the frontier would, in the blue line, has a kind of a stable growth. Your TFP technology, your technology frontier increases and your TFP levels catch up to that. An emerging economy will be in the phase of catching up and therefore have a high current growth rate, but gradually that declines as they are getting closer and closer to their frontier, whereas a developing country that's relatively far from their frontier can boost its GDP growth for a few decades or so before it then runs back until, again, in the very, very long run, going back to the long-term frontier rate. These frontier rates, are region-specific, country-specific. Every country has its own set of circumstances, for example, product market regulations that affect their own frontier. So these frontiers are different by country. So each country catches up to its own technology frontier. And there's this function where your TFP rate or your TFP growth rate is basically a function of your distance to the frontier and the speed of convergence. So the speed of convergence is a parameter that basically drives how quickly are you getting to your frontier. And this then depends on things like openness to international trade. So countries that are more connected to other countries, then that will be able to then share technologies faster and learn technologies faster from other countries and will catch up quicker than countries that are closer to another. And the technology frontier itself is also country specific and, for example, depends on product market regulations and barriers basically to technology developments over time. So we have a bunch of data. We currently have 176 countries in the database. I always like to give an example of which countries we're lacking. And I think at the moment, the major one we're struggling with is Venezuela. And you might be aware that economic growth in the last decade has been quite erratic in Venezuela. Countries that we don't have are, for example, Syria. And we're still thinking about whether we need to exclude Russia and the Ukraine from our projections. But there's lots of other countries, and 176 really means that we capture basically, I think, 98% of global GDP within our projections. So it's really at the country level and more or less global coverage. The countries that we're missing are really the small countries. So for population and education, we use SSP-specific projections that directly come from IASA, and they make these specifically for this exercise. So they have projections of education, projections of GDP. These are gender-specific, these are age cohort-specific, and these are scenario-specific. And then we can match those with the population projections and therefore come up with very detailed projections of labor supply by using labor participation rates. We make detailed projections of labor supply, and we also make detailed projections of education levels, mean years of schooling, and therefore human capital development. Labor market data, other market data, labor market data come from ILO and OECD. We have short-term GDP forecasts that we use as the basis. So basically what we're saying with these SSP scenarios is in the short run, we just use whatever IMF and OECD project for forecast for the coming 3 to 5 years. And we use that as a starting point, and then we start differentiating across the SSP. So there's no jump in 2022 across these scenarios because they all use the same short-term forecast. I've been using the one from the fall 2021 because we felt that the spring 2022 updates might have been either just before the Ukraine war, or they might have been just inside the Ukraine war, but before a lot was clear about how the Ukraine war would affect what kind of measures would be taken by other countries, etc. So we decided to not use the spring 22 update, but we will update to the fall 22 updates and potentially run some scenarios. Energy data come from the IEA, but I have to say these fuel rents that we calculate, the production costs, are actually still based on 2013 assessment that we did. And the reason for that is that it uses proprietary data that we don't have access to on production costs by country. And we're still struggling with finding out a good way to update that. But we're talking to energy modelers about trying to do that. And then the SSP scenarios build on a kind of what I call a background baseline projection, some kind of, a background projection that we use as the basis to then say, well, SSP2 is a bit slower in convergence, or it's quicker, it's etc. So this common starting point for the SSPs is built on the long-term baseline projection of the OECD for OECD countries and major emerging economies. So we're using a starting point that has been discussed with governments and that governments do actually buy it. The demographic projections are made by YASA, and there's plenty of different ways in which they have been updated in the last 10 years. Sorry. Improvements in mortality rates, I think, is the biggest one. People live longer. There's a slowdown in life expectancy at older age that affects mostly OECD countries, etc. We have a new census, so lots of that changes to the demographic data. And you get very nice results, but in interest of time, I'll skip those. So how does it then work when we compare the old SSPs to the new SSPs? And this is something I hope, as for economists, I don't have to explain very elaborately, but we're moving to new PPP exchange rates, so that the prices in which we express our GDP, in which we exchange rates with which we compare across countries, have been updated to the latest IMF World Bank intercomparison exercise. And that's already gives you a new level of GDP if you aggregate that across countries. And actually that gives you a change if you recalibrate the original SSPs to these new PPP exchange rates, you get a higher level of global GDP. And on top of that, if you add in new data for the last 10 years and the short-term forecasts, of course, in 2015, not much will change because we did the analysis in 2012, and a lot of the shocks in the recent data have been after 2015. But already in 2015, the projections were not entirely spot on, as is not surprising. But in the long run, in the right graph for 2100, you already see that the new data, and especially the COVID shock, has lowered GDP growth rates, and therefore using the new short-term forecasts and the latest decade of data, actually lowers your GDP level in 2100. And then if you add on top of that our recalibration or reassessment of the long-term growth rates for SSP2, you get the same projection, of course, for 2015, because it's part of the data years. But for 2100, you get a slightly higher new projection. So we're projecting now global SSP2 to be slightly faster growth than we had 10 years ago. This is still up for discussion. This is quite preliminary. There are a number of things that we need to improve in our modeling, and we have to see whether this still holds in the long run. Also, one thing for the SSPs is that it is a community exercise. What we're doing is we're presenting these GDP projections to the integrated assessment modeling groups. They run that in their integrated assessment models. They look at what happens for them with the energy system, land use system, emission scenarios, and they give us feedback saying, we think that maybe you're over-optimistic for certain countries, under-optimistic for other countries, etc. We also want to have that same discussion on whether we're too optimistic or not optimistic enough with economists group, and basically have an interactive process to then finalize our assumptions on the speed of convergence and the speed of technology growth, etc. So these new projections are very preliminary, and we will have to see how they will end up in the final version. So on the short-term growth rates, the original SSPs, of course, didn't project a COVID crisis. And you can see that short-term growth rates have been quite volatile, and everybody knows this. But if you look at the order of the different regions, so this is high income, upper middle, lower income, lower middle, and low income countries. The order is not that bad, actually. And it's more of a temporary crisis, as we see, than that this has really shifted around and has caused major differences across the different income groups. Now, if you look at it, individual countries, there's huge differences. India is much more affected than China, for example. But the recovery also matters a lot. So there have been clear country differences, but if you look at it in the wider groups, actually, you could say maybe it is to some extent mostly a temporary blip rather than a fundamental change in our global economy. Then on the long run, we do get some differences. We are a little bit more optimistic now on high-income countries, and that also causes the global average to be a little bit higher in the long run. And of course, a permanently higher growth rate has a strong effect on the levels of GDP, and I'll show you right now. For the 6 income groups, first one is non-OECD high-income countries. That's a very tiny group with mostly fossil fuel exporters, countries like Qatar. And we're more pessimistic in the short run, but we're more optimistic in the long run. Same for high-income OECD countries. Upper middle income, it's a bit the same, but actually the original SSP projections were not that bad if you rescale them to the new exchange rates. We're not doing that bad in the original ones. For the lower middle income countries, we are less optimistic, and I think part of that is, and for low income countries especially, I think for those groups, we are more pessimistic on the fossil fuel, on the resource rents, and therefore a little bit less optimistic on countries that rely on resources for their GDP growth. So we're more optimistic basically for higher income countries, less optimistic for lower income countries. And that means that for the global, we are slightly less optimistic. But if you compare it to levels in the original PPPs, the numbers are still much higher because the PPP exchange rates mean higher global GDP levels. So in terms of next steps, we want to fill data gaps. We want to go from 176 to 193 countries. We want to do some interpolation of missing data and extrapolation where we miss some historical data, where we have data sometimes only to 2060, for example, and we need to figure out how to make the best projections after 2060. We want to update the energy information, as I said, and then after summer, we want to update to the fall 2022 forecasts. And I think that is the major determinant of when we will be able to release the final updates of these SSP scenarios, because I think we will have to wait for those before we release the new scenarios. Then for the other SSPs, I've only presented SSP2 so far. For the other SSPs, we are still waiting for the population and education data from YASA. We expect to get them early next week, and then it will take us a few weeks to present that. And then there will be the process, of course, then to validate these new projections. There's going to be presentation of first results for all the SSPs, we hope, at the Scenarios Forum on 21st of June. That's in front of the group of integrated assessment modelers, who will be the primary users of these projections. And that will have a first debate about whether these new projections make sense or not. But then the real test becomes when other models start using these projections and give us feedback on whether they think these new SSP scenarios run smoothly, whether they lead to strange results for specific countries, etc., flag issues. And I want to invite everybody to contact us if they want to also do test runs of these SSP scenarios in their models and do test runs and give us feedback on whether their results make sense or whether there's any major issues with specific countries that we haven't seen ourselves, or where things run very difficult. And potentially, we're still discussing that, is to bring that all together in a webinar sometime in the fall to then do basically a discussion with major users to discuss what are the major changes that we need to make in our numerical assumptions before we finalize these projections. And then last but not least, in terms of next steps, is we think with all the uncertainty on the Ukraine war, all the uncertainty on recovery from COVID, nobody talks about that anymore, but recovery from COVID is still quite uncertain. We're thinking that maybe we need to have scenarios for the long-term consequences of short-term uncertainties, and basically looking at how much do GDP levels and growth rates by the second half of the century, how much do they depend on assumptions that you make for the coming 5 years. And this is something that people tend to ignore, but this might potentially be quite an important effect, not only on the levels of GDP, but also on long-term GDP growth rates. So that's something that might complicate life for users, because then we have suddenly not one projection for SSP2, but maybe 3 projections for SSP2. But we think this might be essential to give an idea of how volatile basically the short term is. And finally, just in 1 minute, basically we want to also keep talking to other economics groups, and we have been talking to people at IMF, GTAP Center, OECD, SEPI, PIC, YASA, about trying to come up with a broader set of economic indicators. So the core SSPs will just be per capita GDP and GDP levels, but we want to actually come up with a wider set of indicators, looking at within country inequality, looking at welfare indicators. There are other groups out there that are looking at structural change and trying to make SSPs for agriculture, industry, services, downscaling of economic indicators to grid set levels, and maybe looking at trade projections and looking at how trade is affected by GDPs and how trade policies affect the GDP of the different countries. So this is still in early stages, but we are talking to other groups, and we might set up something that's probably going to be coordinated jointly between OECD and the GTAP Center for discussing of how we can build on these SSP projections to make a broader set of projections, basically, that are useful for for people that use economic data in their own projections. So that is something that a discussion that we need to continue. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rob. So now let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. So as a reminder, you can either put your questions in the chat and I can read it for you, or you can also raise your hand. And I see already 2 raised hands and 3 raised hands. So by the order they appeared, maybe Angel, you can start.
Sorry, I was clapping, but yes, I did have a question on one of the slides. You had a update on May 2022. Just familiar with the data sets not being available for that exact time period. I imagine that means that you guys collected data up to the last month, but the data was available for 2021. So, and I just wanted to make sure that we got that kink of 2020 to 21 exactly like a bounce. If that's the case, that's just clarification. Thank you, Rob. Nice presentation.
Jean, do you want to collect questions, or shall I just answer one-on-one?
Oh, sure, we can take Dominic's and Wolfgang's before. So Dominic, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rob, for the presentation. We had a discussion on this yesterday at the board meeting, as you're aware of, since you gave me some of the slides. One of the issues that came up was capital flows. And so I don't know if you've been looking into that. There was a suggestion that we should talk more with the macroeconomists. So perhaps at the OECD, certainly at the fund as well. So something to think about, I think.
We can take Wolfgang's question and then going back to Rob.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rob. Excellent presentation, and very nice to hear that there will be an update available of these projections. We had been using them in the group, and what strikes me now is basically that we likely generate inconsistencies in the sense that you have forecasts of labor participation rates, of TFP, or these resource rents, which drive your projections, but they're currently not available at the YASA portal. And I guess it would be great basically for this, let's say, kind of downscaling exercises where you go into structural detail or land use or whatever, yeah, if those drivers would also be available to increase the consistencies across these exercises. Thanks.
All right, 3 very good questions. Let me take them in order. For Angel, the May 2022 update doesn't mean that we updated all the data to May 2022. No. What we do is we take the data from the short-term forecasts by IMF and OECD, which means that they have, so those were from fall 2021, which means that they had a good handle on, I think you can call 2020 a data point, although you can, there will still be revisions, I'm sure, of 2020 GDP levels in the next update. Actually, the OECD short-term forecasts are updated today. I think they launched them an hour ago. So there will be some revisions to 2020 as they have better handle and get more background data, etc. So what we do in our new projections is until 2025, we treat the forecasts from IMF and OECD as data. So for us, they are inputs, and we do not, and we just mimic them. And we make sure that our drivers lead to exactly those results. And then we do our own model projections from 2026 onwards. So for us, it's basically data until 2025. Although I realize that for IMF and for OECD, 2021 to 2025 are actually forecasts and not data points. Then for Dominique, capital flows. Yes, it's a very good point. And we have been discussing with our economics department colleagues for 10 years. Started out that we tended to disagree on whether long-term whether you have a convergence rule for investment flows or for capital to output ratios. So you have either you say that there are bounds on capital to output ratios, or you say that there is some sort of rule that ties investment rates and savings rates across countries, and that there's gradual convergence across countries. Now, it's not as full convergence. In either case, there is, it's about between bounds, but it's about what drives what, and which do you assume is kind of in the process of converging, and which do you assume is then a result of that convergence process and is an indicator that you calculate. We used to disagree. We have ongoing talks with them, and I think the outcome will be that we will revise in summer, and we will stick to what our macroeconomists assume in their long-term projections. So we will make an update of our SSP projections to make sure that our long-term capital accumulation assumptions are aligned with the macroeconomists' latest views. And finally, for Wolfgang, different drivers being available on the YASA website. Clearly, this is not the purpose. We won't do that on the YASA website, because for the SSP projections themselves, they have basically population and GDP, and those are the drivers in the integrated assessment models. I've always been reluctant when people ask me for individual drivers, because individual drivers, if you have a different model, for example, if I give you labor participation rates and labor supply, but you have a model without human capital to then convert number of people into efficiency labor, and I do the calculations with human capital indicator separated, you get an inconsistency in the labor inputs and the contribution of labor to GDP. So there's always a trade-off. The full set of drivers for us matches our GDP projections. I think you either take the GDP projections and then match your drivers to match those GDP projections by tweaking your own drivers if you have a different setup. But one of the things that we want to do, it's not entirely confirmed, but I'm quite certain that we will actually be able to share the data sets with the drivers on the OECD websites and try to make, because we feel that there are a number of groups out there that are not directly interested in the emission scenarios, but are actually interested in the socioeconomic drivers. So we want to have some sort of portal on the OECD website to make the drivers and the GDP projection together available. We don't have an agreement yet from YASA whether we can include our education and population drivers in that, but I hope that they will be able to do that. And otherwise we need to find some sort of approximation for that. But we do intend to make more data available, but that might be the end of the year before that's publicly available. And then separately, the GDP will still, the updated GDP will become available at the YASA website as well, because that's input for the integrated system models.
So thank you again, Rob. I'm sorry, Paul, we are already running out of time, but I invite you maybe to ask your question in the chat, and maybe Rob can answer that afterwards. So thank you again, Rob. Our next presenter is Rienne Wilts from the University of Bonn. We will be presenting her paper named Quantifying SDG Indicators for Multiple SSPs up to 2050, with a focus on selected low and low-middle income countries and a bioeconomy based on CG analysis. So Rienne, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can you see the slides? Okay, perfect.
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. So my name is Rienne. I'm a PhD student at the group of Wolfgang Britz at the University of Bonn. And so today I will present our work on the quantification of SDG indicators in CGE models. And we will also construct a baseline for different shared socioeconomic pathways up to the year 2050, with a special focus on selected low and low middle income countries. Sorry. Yeah, so sustainable development is a multidimensional process and therefore requires a large variety of indicators to depict this process. And this we can also see here, as there are 17 different sustainable development goals, or SDGs. Yeah, so as there is a large number of indicators required, there is an official indicator framework defined by the UN, where for each target of every goal, there's at least one indicator defined. And we here, for the indicator collection process for CGE Box, which is the CGE model we are using for this analysis, analyzed these indicators based on their implementability to CGE Box. So we analyzed whether these indicators are quantitative indicators, whether there is data available to depict the indicator, and also whether they could be linked to an endogenous variable in the model, such that they would adjust in a baseline. After that, we went through other literature, for example, the Sustainable Development Report of 2021, which calculates SDG indexes for different countries using 121 indicators. And there have been previous studies that analyzed SDGs in CGE models. And yeah, I've listed here 3. So the first one calculated the composite indicators of 23 indicators, which are not directly linked to separate SDGs. And there's the second one included about 71 indicators that link to 7 SDGs. And the last study drew on 9 indicators that are linked to 5 SDGs. From here, we also defined the research gap. So especially distributional effects regarding income, food security or equality were not yet covered in CGE models. But there are several SDGs indicators that specifically focus on this distribution. And also a large detail on agriculture could be useful for a number of SDGs. And we also found that so far, no indicator had been implemented to SDG 4, 5, 14, and 17. So so here I've grouped the indicators that we collected and implemented to CGE box, and I've linked them to the respective SDG. The ones that are marked in blue are here again which I've previously mentioned as research gap. And so we could find for every but SDG 4 at least one indicator that matches the model structure and relates to the respective SDG. In total, we implement about 70 indicators. In order to implement the listed indicators, we need data, and we started with the GTAP version 10 standard data, and we could calculate indicators for SDG 9, 12, and 17. For other indicators, we needed auxiliary data such as the air pollution for SDG 3, CO2 and non-CO2 emissions for SDG 7, 8, and 13, and also the extensions of GTAP power for SDG 7 and GTAP IZ for SDG 15. We then also added new data as, for example, to analyze the distributional effects for SDG 1, 2, 7, and 10. We added household level detail from household surveys from the FAO. And in order to better depict nutrition or food security issues, we included for SDG 2 nutrients attributed to consumptions, and we split up the agri-food sectors to 46 sectors. We differentiate labor by gender based on data from the World Bank, and we include irrigation water as primary factor to analyze issues with SDG 6, so clean water and sanitation. We also analyze the urban area extension with a regression that links the per capita urban area to GDP per capita change, the urbanization rate, and also the overall population density. And then finally, we split up the fishery sector into an open catch and agricultural sector. So we use here, this is implemented to CGE box. And this includes also the splits and the data handling. And we come up with this database for the baseline generation. So we have 31 regions, which also include the 10 low and low middle income countries. And it includes 110 products and 141 sectors. The difference here arises as the production of irrigated and rain-fed production and also the agriculture production is split up, but they produce the same product. And then we have here evolved nestings for demand and production, which include the power and IZ, which also meat, cereals, vegetables, and feedstock. So yeah, we just heard about the SSP. So we built our analysis on 3 of the shared socioeconomic pathways. Specifically, we take SSP1, the sustainability scenario, and SSP2, the middle of the road scenario, and SSP3 as a regional rivalry scenario with high challenges for mitigation and adaptation. From there, we take the macroeconomic projections, which match these narratives. We take here GDP per capita, the demographics, the education level, and also the urbanization rate. And we also add scenario-specific assumptions on a CO2 price, the meat consumption. And for SSP3, we add the tariffs and the preference shift towards domestic production. We then use this information in GRDEM, which is the long-term baseline generation model, and the macro projections are used here as boundary conditions. So in order to meet the GDP per capita change over time, endogenously in the model, the total factor productivity growth adjusts differently for different sectors. And we depict demand by the Maidats demand system, which includes non-linear angle curves. And other features are, for example, that it includes debt accumulation from foreign savings and trade imbalances, and also macro saving rates that are linked to population and income dynamics, and also industrial cost shares that change over time with income. And finally, we use crop yield and cropland forecasts from the FAO. So so in order to depict distributional effects that are for some indicators more important than the average effect, and we look here into income and nutrition, for example, we take the FAO household surveys for these 10 low and low middle income countries. The surveys include detail on the household income composition. So it includes different sources of income, including, for example, wage categories, self-employed work, or agricultural work. And it has a special focus on farming households, and it does not include information on consumption. So we then take the data from the base data from the survey and update it until for the year 2050. And we use here a CET function, so household can change the source of the income over time. And in order to update the income, we use, for example, for wage income, the factor returns to the skill category of the sectors. And for example, for agricultural sector, we also include, so we not only include labor, but also the factor returns to capital and land. And from this updated income, we then derive demand using the Maidats demand system, which calculates the changes in the commitment term and also in the budget shares. This results then into the single household results, from where we calculate, or which we summarize into 500 percentiles for the results analysis. So now I come to the results. So the results are structured as follows. We have, again, summed them into so where the data comes from. So first we start with the GTAP standard model, then we go to the auxiliary data, and finally to the new data. And then I will also show some distributional graphs. So we see here the relative change over time from 2014 to 2050 for the different countries, which are here the 10 low and low middle income countries, and for the different SSPs. You see that the scale is set to from 1 to -1 in order to allow to see changes that are smaller, and the larger changes are here then marked with the respective number in the respective cell of the country in the indicator. So this here green means that an indicator actually improves. So it does not necessarily mean that the indicator increases. So some results are inverted. And so red means here that it goes into the opposite direction of the target. We see here first for SDG 2 that it generally improves over time. So in terms of average food consumption per capita and the share of income spent on food, this improves over time, while we see that the food price index increases for all countries and all SSPs besides Nigeria and Vietnam. In contrast, the energy price index increases in SSP1 and SSP2 for all countries. In terms of the economic indicators, so SDG 8, we see that it improves for all countries and all SSPs, following the projections. Real GDP per capita and real GDP per employed person increases, but also the agricultural, so the share of labor working agriculture decreases over time. In contrast, the share of also the share of manufacturing on GDP decreases over time, and also the manufacturing labor decreases on total labor. We observe here that the material footprint related to SDG 12 strongly increases in all SSPs in all countries, especially in SSP 1, which is linked to the strong output increase in this scenario. So now here we have the auxiliary data, and we still see that SDG 2 improves over time. So the productivity for different crop groups improves over time, while here the air pollution, which are linked here to human health, strongly increase over time for all countries and all SSPs. This is again indicators from auxiliary data, and we see here below SDG 7 that for some indicators there's no data available for some countries, so this cell is then left blank. Yet we see that the fossil fuel demand improves over time, so it decreases, while mostly the renewable energy demand increases in the SSPs for most countries. So in terms of the environmental indicator, we see again that GDP, greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and the total greenhouse gas emissions increase over time. However, we see a decoupling of the greenhouse gas emission growth compared to the GDP growth, with some outliers. And also in terms of the natural vegetation, we see that it reduces over time. So the area of natural vegetation and the share of unmanaged forest decreases, while the share of forestry and the area of the grassland improves. Yet we also see that the stocking density increases in most countries and SSPs, which means that this would take away the potential biodiversity benefit of grassland. So finally, we come to the new data. We see here that for SDG 1, the share of households living below a certain threshold per capita per day decreases over time. And we see again that SDG 2 improves. So the calories, fat, and proteins consumed per capita increase over time. In contrast, the water use also strongly increases, so worsens over time. And we also observe that the inequality is reduced. So in general, the Gini and the Palmer index improve over time. I have here 2 examples. Sorry, the first one should be Ethiopia. So we see in Ethiopia that there the Gini index and the Palmer index improves, while in Ethiopia there's a slight reduction in the Gini and Palmer index. The urban area increases in all countries and all SSPs. And finally, the catched fish, or the share of catched fish on total fish, increases over time. And also the share of the fish sector on GDP increases. So here, as an example, I have some income distribution per capita. We see, as I mentioned before, in Vietnam, that for all households, the income increases, however, rather unequal. So while in contrast in Ethiopia, we see that seeing that the blue line is the baseline, that, for example, in SSP 1, the income increases more equally for different households. And from this income distribution, we calculated then the Gini index, the Palmer index, and also the dollar per capita per day. Another example is here the calorie consumption per capita. And we also see here that they follow the income increase for both countries. And this is calculated from the food consumption distribution. And from there, we also calculate the food diversity index, which measures how equally the households derive their food consumption from different food groups. And finally, I have here the energy budget share, which also increases over time. So from the blue line to the other 3 lines, there's an increase in both countries. yeah, so with increasing income, the households spend more money on energy. So yeah, with this, I would like to summarize. So we saw that already with the standard GTAP version 10 database, we could quantify 7 SDGs, with then the auxiliary data being the Etiquette and power extensions, but also CO2, non-CO2 emissions and air pollutions. We could add indicators for 6 SDGs, and with the new data, which were the household survey, the agri-food detail, but also the agriculture split, we could analyze distribution effects for 3 SDGs and add 5 more SDGs to the assessment. And with this framework, we can now then construct baselines and counterfactual scenarios in order to analyze, for example, the sustainability of policy decisions. So yeah, with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rienne. Now let's take some questions. So please use the chat or raise your virtual hand to ask a question to the presenter. To let you time to prepare your questions, I think I have one, if I may start. So overall, from the results you've shown, it looks like the wealth indicators are, let's say, okay from an SDG perspective, while the environmental indicators, almost all of them, climate, air pollution, are deteriorating. So I was wondering what was the kind of, if you could give us a bit more detail on the assumption you had for this environmental intensity. Do you have some sort of improvement over time, or are you considering, let's say, constant emission factors?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the emission factors stay constant over time. This is also why they, for example, strongly increase for SSP1 as output there strongly increases. Yeah, so there's no improvement in terms of emissions over time.
Thank you. Rob, you also have one question.
Yeah, thanks. For a moment I was silent because it's shocking how much data you process and how detailed all this analysis is. I'm really very impressed with all that. So congratulations on that first.
Thank you.
My question is on the differentiation across SSPs and to what how far did you go? Can you say a little bit more about how far you went into looking at whether individual drivers of land use, energy, etc., are differentiated across SSPs? And for some of them, there's of course quantitative data on the YASA website, but for others, other like inequality, you have to rely on the storylines and then do a quantification of that. So can you say a little bit more on how you went about to do that? And I think I would like to invite you to be part of this discussion that I was talking about, where we want to talk to other economists group about how do we broaden SSP economics projections from SSPs to things like inequality, because I think it's good to do a model comparison exercise on things like this to really come up with robust quantifications of SSP scenarios.
Yeah, thank you very much. We differentiated the SSPs first based on the GDP per capita and this information, but then we just changed the CO2 price assumptions and also the meat consumption changed, and we added the FAO detail on yield and the land use forecasts, which are differentiated by SSPs. But besides that, there's no difference between the scenario. This is all endogenous in the model based on what we add, but there's no specific assumption on inequality in SSP1, for example.
Thank you. Is there any other question? If not, I may go ahead with a second one I had because I found the presentation very interesting. Sorry. I was wondering, so you presented a baseline exercise, so 3 baseline exercise with this SDG framework. Do you plan, is it by design made for only baseline exercise, or would you be able to have counterfactual analysis afterwards? Because when seeing for the trade-offs between the different environmental indicators or wealth and environmental indicators, it would be very useful. So do you plan that, and have you already tested?
Yes, so the idea is to then later, for example, perform a counterfactual analysis with different bioeconomy scenarios. And yeah, for example, in the counterfactual scenarios, then GDP is turned endogenous, while then the total factor productivity from the baseline is taken. So then we can also see changes in this indicator, which was now exogenously provided. Yeah, so this is the plan.
And as a side question, I know that CGE Box is open source. Do you plan to release this part, or maybe it's already there?
Not yet, but yes, I would say it's released.
Thank you. I see a question from Lindsay. I can read it through, except Lindsay, please feel free to interrupt me if you want to ask directly. She thanks you for your presentation, and she asked how many of the 70 indicators were taken from the literature and how many new indicators were added in this study.
Okay, I don't know the exact number, and this is so I think most of them are taken from the literature, including this official indicator list from the UN. But so some of them were not included so far in CGE models, so they are not new. For example, as the share, the dollar per capita per day. This was not captured before, but this is not a new indicator because it's well known and it's from this indicator list.
Thank you. If there is no more question, I think we can go. I'm sorry, Rob, I forgot for you, but we can go for a round of virtual applause. So thank you very much, Rienne, for this presentation and for the discussion. So our next presenter is Victor Nechifor. I'm sorry if I misspell your name, from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And he's going to present his paper called CGE Model Calibration using multi-objective evolutionary algorithms. So Victor, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Very delighted to be here among such very rich presentation. So I will present a little bit about a recent project that we initiated here at the JRC, which we work with Mohammed Bashir, who's also from, well, he's from outside, he's from the University of Manchester. And it's a project that at this stage refers strictly to single region, so country level CGE model calibration or baseline construction. Well, in the following slides, I will basically talk about ways to improve the model calibration by improving the parameterization of the model in relation to behavioral parameters. So in particular, I will be talking about trade elasticities.
Victor, I'm sorry to interrupt. In the presentation, we have the Zoom interface overlay, okay. So maybe it would hide some of your slides.
It's a bit better now, I suppose.
Yeah.
So indeed, we were trying to use something that comes a little bit outside from outside the field of economics. So it's the area of multi-objective evolutionary algorithms, MOA for short. It's not the first time we're using this in combination with CGE models, and Mohammed will present in the next session 9, I think, nice application of this framework in relation to SDGs, if you're curious. But going back to we're aiming to do in this project. So, well, just maybe a few words about baseline calibration, and before jumping into the challenges that we're trying to address through this new framework. So baseline, the calibration process is basically an effort where we're trying to improve how the model responds in relation to some target values that we have in mind. So the usual suspect would be GDP, which is something that's maybe fairly easy to do in a CG model to calibrate that. But then we could go into more detail about how the baseline looks like. So we could look at structural change, we could look at evolution of trade volumes. So we could get to the level of commodity and activity and when we're trying to improve the model response. So basically, we will end up with a set of target values and our model response, and we will try to reduce the distance or the error between these two vectors. So the challenges that we see at this stage, also in our work, or applied work here at the JRC, is that there are trade-offs between calibration objectives, because we have competing responses in the CG model, and we're trying to balance those. We could do that by changing the behavioral parameters in the model, so the elasticity. So then we end up with the set of errors that, for instance, we could synthesize and bring together in a single calibration objective. And here we have the example of the cross entropy approach established over 20 years ago, which tries to enlarge basically a CG model with calibration objective, the cross entropy in this case, and then it becomes a nonlinear problem where we're trying to minimize the aggregate error. So the challenge that we see here is that if you have a single objective, then you will have a single solution. You will see the trade-offs at that point between the different calibration objectives, but you will not have like a wider view unless you start adjusting the objective function to get more points and more information about how the trade-off actually works. Now, then there's another practice where we don't use at all such a calibration objective, and then it goes down to a labor-intensive work where we're trying to play around with behavioral parameters and then get some results, and then hope that the overall error will be reduced. Manual iterations with no guarantee success. We might miss the space of parameter values that might really reduce the overall error. Another set of challenges would be the fact that doing something like cross entropy requires some time investment. So we basically need to change the variables and the equations in the model. So because the cross entropy, for instance, uses time series for observed variables that we are trying to match with the model response, then we need to add a time dimension to all the variables in equations, which is something that's additional work, and with large model this it can create some headaches. And also there's the recursive dynamic part where unless we're also willing to put the intertemporal relationships around things like capital accumulation or migration, then we need to make some simplifying assumption about how these evolve over time. So we see some challenges there, and from a model user's perspective, we're trying to put this MOA framework in order to not have to do all these things. So just a few words about the MOA, what it does. Sorry, this is a bit tricky, but okay. So it's a multi-objective framework. It's basically an iterative evaluation process of multiple data points, through which the algorithm basically tries to construct a Pareto front, approximation of a Pareto front across a number of objectives. And in this case, you have a stylized example here of two objectives. We're trying to maximize the two objectives. You would have suboptimal results, and then basically based on the objective value of each point, then there's a sorting process through which the MOEA tries to take out the dominated solutions, so the things that are not very interesting because there are better points out there. Better in the case of model calibration, there are better model configurations that improve the model response. Now it's an iterative process because basically the MOEA takes a bunch of points, or a bunch of, let's say in this case the calibration, you take a set of different model configurations, and then with the CG, then it would throw all these configurations to the CG. The CG would run, and then would retrieve some solution with the information that's important for the objective calculation by the MOA. It could be a variable that's directly taken from the CG, or it could be something that the MOA then calculates based on a number of variables. And then these, as I said, there's multiple points that so multiple configurations being done in a parallel fashion, and then the MOA retrieves all the solutions and it does the sorting process that I was referring to. And then once this is done, there's a Pareto front constructed, and then it proceeds to the next iteration. And in order to proceed to the next iteration, it will need to generate new points, and it will do this based on evolutionary principles by taking those points that are on the Pareto front and trying to generate new points through crossover and mutation processes similar to genetics, right? So all these points in the new iteration will form part of a new generation, which will basically lead to an improved or a higher Pareto front. This obviously going to the calibration exercise, then it becomes a minimization process. So instead of having the points above the front, below, you will have them above. So basically through the iteration process, this front should become lower and lower and lower as the iterations go through. Now, just a little example of how these points are generated. So as we have different solvers for optimization problems, we have different algorithms in the MOEA. This is an example of NSGA, which is an acronym for non-sorted, non-dominated sorting genetic algorithm. And it's basically what I was saying, in the sense that it would take a number of parents, which are, some of them are on the Pareto front, and then from those it will try to generate some offsprings and then pass them on to the CG models, and it will do that recursively until either a stopping criteria is met or the number of iteration is limited, is reached. In this example, the NSGA2 uses population sizes of 100, which means that the MOEA will generate 100 different CG model configurations, and then these will be solved in parallel by the CG, and with the solutions being retrieved thereafter for the sorting process. Why do we advocate for this MOEA? Because it has a number of advantages. So we consider it to be relatively easy to implement. So we have algorithms which are readily available in Python libraries. So for this exercise, we are using Platypus as a library. In terms of CG model changes, there's really just very little changes that are required because the mathematical formulations are not necessary. The MOA is based on meta heuristics to construct the Pareto front. However, there are some hurdles in terms of constructing the communication between the Python based MOA and the GAMS based CG in our case. But we considered this to be a good investment if we are to use the CG for a number of applications. And for instance, in our case, we have the same Demetra model that we're applying for different countries, so we can use this framework for a lot of different situations. Another nice advantage is that it makes use of parallel processing, which we can do very nicely in Python, using the Python GAMS Python API. It's flexible. It can easily be adjusted to add what we call decision variables, but in CG jargon, these are basically model parameters or fixed variables that are that the MOA plays with. And we can also add objectives fairly easily. It can work with different type of variables. So these are, this adds to the flexibility of this framework. Another very nice thing that we have is that we use exactly the same CG model specification that we would use in normal simulations, which we can embed into the MOA framework. So there's no problem of using by accident two different specifications because I've changed something in one equations or I've changed something in one closure rule, and then I will get different results. And then last, which you can't really see, is that because we have information across the whole Pareto front, it will give us a more global view on how the model behaves. So it will reveal some maybe hidden information on how the model implementation works around the minimums or maximums of the objectives that we've set, but also beyond. So it will look at the range of values for the objectives. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is basically take what we call this OptCGE, this calibration framework. We take the JRC, the Demetra model that we're using extensively in policy analysis, in African context in particular, the single country CG. And what we want to do is first do a stylized calibration. So we take the model trade baseline, which we're trying to, for particular import quantities, we're trying to align those with that of a global model baseline like Magnet. So basically Magnet acts as the growth in import quantities act as target values for calibration exercise. As I said, we take the GAMS model and we put it into the Python-based algorithm with Python API, and then the Python algorithm is the one that runs the MOA. And we can specify alternative genetic algorithms. And here, well, it's just a summarization of what's going on. The MOA determines the N vectors of model characteristics, in our case, N sets of different values for our elasticities. And then the GAMS model will solve them in parallel. We'll retrieve we'll send back the solution to the MOA, and there will be the sorting and up to the process. It will continue as an iteration up to the convergence criteria is met. Okay, setup. Sorry, I don't know how to fix this so that it doesn't cover things. So we really started small to test how this framework works. So we started with the Kenya model, Kenya SAM for Demetra. It's a small SAM, only 4 sector, 1 household, only 3 traded commodities: agri-food, manufacturing, and services. We're running the process over 6-year time steps between 2020 and 2025. There's a calibration mode in the sense that our GDP is not necessarily, real GDP is not part of the MOA search, but is an endogenous variable, and then is a fixed variable, sorry, and then TFP acts as a variable. And then from Magnet, we take into the Demetra model changes in world import and export prices. So the closure would then imply that the quantities on imports and exports will be those that will be free. And these are the ones that we will use as to inform our objectives. So the MOA search, the definition would be, we have these elasticities that the MOA will vary. So we have Armington elasticities and CT, so the export elasticity specific for a single country model. And then for different objectives that are minimized. So the mean average bias for the individual import quantity growth. So these are three objectives since we have three commodities. And then we've also added the cross entropy objective in the spirit of Arndt et al., which is based on sigma prior values and distributions, and then on growth, import quantity growth errors. And then for sigma, we've set a prior value at 3 for this Armington elasticity. And then we've also constrained a little bit the search space, because we can do that in the MOA. So we tell it to look for sigma values between 2.4 and 4.2, and for the omega a little bit broader than that. Now, this first set of results would kind of show you how the iterative process works, give you a bit of a flavor. So we see here the Pareto fronts that are constructed in the first iteration, but then going to the 20th generation. So after 20 iterations, how the points change. So these are the errors between, so the mean bias error of import quantities for manufacturing and agri-food. We see, because we have 4 objectives, obviously it's not going to be a nice curve, because it becomes 4-dimensional, the Pareto front. But what we can already see is that there is a trade-off between these 2 errors, but also that the overall errors manage to decline. So our points get onto a lower level when we go to the 20th generation. On the right side, we have an example of whether sigma, so the Armington elasticity for agri-food, can influence the amount of, well, the error for the agri-food error imports. And because we've had a lower value of 2.4 for our sigma, we see that the MOA already gets to the lower bound, which would inform us that we would need maybe to increase the space where the MOA can look. But we see already that there are some differences between the first iteration and the 20th generation, which goes along with the improvement of the Pareto front that the MOA is aiming to improve. Now, what are the kind of data that we can get out? So here you have, after the 220 iterations, you would have 400 different points generated within that iteration by the MOA, so 400 solutions. And because we have 4 objectives, well, it's difficult to depict them otherwise, but we're using this parallel coordinates plot, which basically shows that when you have, well, let's say a diagonal line between 2 objectives like this, you can clearly see that there's a trade-off between them. Whereas when you have parallel lines, you see that there's synergy. So for instance, here between the error in manufacturing and services, they kind of go, there's a synergetic move there, whereas for agri-food and manufacturing, there's a trade-off. This also allows us a little bit to see where the MOA is trying to search for values. So we see that there's a high density here, for instance, for sigma, which is going towards the lower bound that we've set. And also for the omega, we also see that, it's trying to go towards very high levels in some instances. Here in these red lines are basically the prior values that we are using for the sigma values to calculate the cross entropy objective. So some interesting maybe cases here.
Victor, sorry, 2 more minutes.
Sure, I'll wrap it up. Sure. So this is just to show we have the cross entropy minimum, which would be basically the standard approach if we are to have a single objective in an optimization, well, a minimization problem, GAMS, for instance. We would see here the trade-offs, right, between the different errors, but also between the sigma, and we see here that the cross entropy is basically favoring a little bit the sigma value. So it's trying not to go too far away from the prior values, but it's sacrificing more the errors here. So errors are pretty high. And here we have the other examples where we see that we can further minimize the individual errors, but this comes at a cost where we have to decrease, for instance, the sigma for agri-foods and for all the other. We can also find some compromise solutions where have a reduction in overall errors relative to the minimum cross entropy, but we clearly see the cost that this has, because you have to move away from the prior values for the sigma, and so on. So this is what we wanted to show you. These are really preliminary results that we have, but we think they're fairly promising. So what we consider is that this MOA framework will provide for a supple way to do estimation of model parameters by building on previous estimation work, like the one in the cross entropy literature for behavioral parameter estimation. So we were successfully able to put the cross entropy as an individual metric. But in addition to that, we see that the MOA can also give us much more information. So we see the full solution space along the Pareto front, which allows us to explore better a bit the trade-offs between the calibration objectives and also between the objectives and the estimated parameters, or the parameters that we will be using after the calibration process is over. Because the evaluation of the CG through the MOA can be very parallel. We can use parallel processing for this to speed up the search process. And of course, looking forward, we're planning to use it on a properly full-blown SAM, so a large SAM with 50-something sectors. And well, with such a SAM, we will have much more parameters. So we're also thinking of using some machine learning techniques to start, move away from the parallel coordinates plot to more advanced evaluation processes to determine the individual parameter importance in the baseline construction. That was me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for this very interesting presentation. So let's now turn to the discussion. So please use the chat or raise your hand if you have a question. And I already see Wolfgang as one. So Wolfgang, please go ahead.
This was clapping, but I wanted to give other people a chance.
Sorry.
But perhaps, Victor, first for clarification. So if I understand this well, basically, what you're trying is to move away from our classical, let's say, closure swap approach, where you basically fix a certain variable, which is normally endogenous, and then solve for a parameter, which could be also something like a substitution elasticity. So that is more for clarification. Second, have you looked into expanded mathematical programming in GAMS? I mean, basically, I mean, the problem we usually have is that we have this one-to-one closure swapping, right? So if you consider multiple parameters, a higher dimensionality in the parameter space than in the variables you fix, you get the trade-off which you describe. Yeah, you want to stay close to basically some a priori information of the parameters. Yeah, but you could change 50 parameters basically to target 5 variables. Yeah, so I think that's something which can be handled by EMP, and I have used this basically to optimize social welfare, not for calibration, and that is relatively straightforward. So you basically declare your model in a different way in GAMS, and then you can solve an objective over in CGE with 3 variables.
But that would be a single objective, I understand.
Yeah, but I mean, if you have multiple but a single objective does not mean basically that it's not something which aggregates over different deviations, right? In the end, you also need to pick one parameter set, which requires basically that you define some penalty function across all the differences you consider, right? Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Sorry, should I answer this, or I can't see whether there's other questions?
No.
Should we bundle them?
No, not for the moment, but maybe I can add one short one to add to Wolfgang's. So I'm sorry if it's not well informed, but I'm stepping clearly out of my comfort zone with this presentation. I was wondering about the implication for the results that of the CGE. For instance, if you select a set of Hamilton elasticities with your procedure, have you tried to compare with what comes out the empirical estimations, so the one in GTAP or in the SSP estimates, and yeah, that's, how do they compare? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think if we don't have any other
Can I have a question too, which is sort of related? This is a related question. If we taking the SSP world, so you've got 5 scenarios, 5 baseline scenarios. Would your method imply that you'd have a different set of parameters for each scenario? Because you're trying to hit GDP targets and so on, and what things that are varying as such as trade. So it would. So the question is, would your method imply 5 different sets of parameters? If the answer to that's yes, then how would you then proceed to do a policy experiment from a baseline? Because you wouldn't really know which set of parameters to choose, or should you then adopt a sensitivity approach?
Thank you. I think you can answer no, Victor, and if there are other questions, we will take them afterwards.
Thank you. Well, to answer Wolfgang, indeed, it could be very much of a hybrid approach. So it doesn't mean that we cannot endogenize certain things in the way we were doing in the classical way. So referring to the closure swapping, we still, for instance, in these runs, we're running in a calibration mode where we're fixing GDP and endogenizing TFP, because we know that that's something that's fairly easy for the model to solve. But maybe there are some things where we're entering the very nonlinear part of the model where endogenizing the elasticities might create some issues. So we're basically trying to avoid having maybe some very difficult things for the GAMs to solve and do that externally through the MOA. So it could be very much of a hybrid approach where we leave GAMs to do the things that we can do easily, and then from outside certain parameters can be played with the MOA. I'm not very familiar with expanded math programming. Sorry, I should have done my homework and looked more into this, but from what I understand, well, there's one objective which, in the same way the cross entropy approach allows for the introduction of this penalty, right? Moving away from expected values is the more you move away, the more the higher your objective is. So and even within these objectives, you have some leeway now to give certain weights to specific errors, or like the cross entropy would have the precision and prediction components, which have different weights. So even there, you have some leeway in the way you kind of define your objectives. But basically, we're not trying to replace that. If we can put some of these objectives in the MOA, very good, then we did that with the cross entropy example. But what we're also trying to do is also allow the user to see how the model performs around the different values of more this compounded calibration objectives. We're moving away from the minimum and want to see what are the costs involved. So to allow the modeler to learn more about how the model performs, and I think that's kind of the added value of the MOA. Then for Jean, you thought, sorry, I think there was something about implications for the Armington elasticities when we're going into the normal simulation mode, but I think I might have lost that question.
So that was the objective, but my question was more specific on the outcome of your calibration exercise, which gets you elasticities of substitution, the Hamilton ones, which are pretty well estimated in the literature. So how does this compare, and what are the advantages and trade-offs?
Indeed. So, well, this was what we did with the cross entropy again, was just to exemplify and simplify, where we assume the value of 3 for all the 3 commodities. But of course, we can go into the literature, take the distributions and the values from hummuls, for instance, and put them into the cross entropy part, so that we have an objective that prevents us from going too far away from these values. So this is, it's really up to the modeler how she or he wants to use the framework and how to define the calibration objective. So all the additional information that we have about target values for these parameters, we can use them in the same way.
If I may just a short follow-up, sorry, a very short one.
Please.
I have to be sure I understand. So it means, for instance, with your procedure, we could have a regional differentiated elasticities, because a lot of the estimations are global. So it could introduce, let's say, regional differentiation, for instance.
Indeed, yes. Okay. Ideally, we haven't tried the global model because we're getting into much bigger models, but who knows? Maybe we'll get to that point. And indeed, in theory, you could use the MOA to have regionally specific solutions for the trade elasticity. For Paul, indeed, with different SSPs, you would have different GDPs, so you could expect to have different solutions for your objective minimums. But then I'm also thinking you could again have even a sum of sums, of all the errors, and take all the SSPs together and try to find the middle ground across these for your elasticity and for your GDP deviations around the SSP. So again, trying to find the middle ground, or as you mentioned, you can do do the sensitivity analysis where you take individual SSPs, get that one ideal solution for each, and then play with the model and see what it does, and also how different this parameterization is.
So thank you, every participant, for the discussion, and thank you again, Victor, for this very interesting presentation. If there is no more questions, we have 1 or 2 minutes. We are 1 or 2 minutes ahead of time, but if there is no more question, I guess we can turn to our next presentation. So please give a round of virtual applause to Victor. Thank you very much. And for next time, I will try to not misinterpret the applause button with the hand raise button. So our next presenter is Nadia Ouedraogo. She's from the UN Economic Commission for Africa. So Nadia, can you please, yes, thank you. So the floor is yours. Sorry, I forgot to mention. So your presentation will be about modeling sustainable long-term electricity supply demand in Central Africa for industrialization and economic diversification. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to start by giving, I hope you are seeing my slides. It's okay?
Not in presentation mode, though. We're seeing the PowerPoint interface.
Okay. Let's see.
Fine now? Perfect. Yes, perfect.
Okay. So I wanted to start with a bit of context. Why particularly this sub-region? Okay, Central Africa here is considered as the Economic Commission of Central African States, the Etiquette, who is composed of 11 countries: Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Sao Tome, Republic of the Congo, Angola, Chad, Central African Republic, DRC, Rwanda, and Burundi. This sub-region is composed of many oil producing countries and exporting oil exporting countries. But even so, population has a little access to electricity, to energy in general, and in electricity in particular. For instance, with 11% of the continental population, they are only consuming 8% of the total energy of African total energy. Primary energy consumption is very low, and the average energy consumption per capita as well, even though that average energy consumption per capita in Africa is low, in Central Africa is even lower. It's less than the 0.7 ton of oil equivalent. Less than the half of the population has access to electricity, or about 45%. On the productive side of energy access, we have also to know that there is a limited availability. The limited availability of reliable and affordable electricity has conditioned the industrial structure of the Central African sub-region so far. Countries are light manufacturing industries with relatively low energy intensity. Those industries required less energy than the much more developed one. What I said at the beginning is the sub-region is really heavily depending on the fuel, on natural resources in general, and in particular on oil exportation. The issue with that is the economies are depending on or are impacted by the fluctuation in world natural resources plan on world commodities prices, and in particular on the oil prices, leading to many impact on the economies, and in particular, and hindering their economic development so far. The different countries at the national levels and also at the sub-regional levels are trying to put in place some policies in order to speed up the diversification and industrialization, in order to depend less on the commodities, on oil exports, and limited the impact of global crisis on their economy, as well as speed up the socioeconomic development. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the implementation of such policies cannot be effective since given the energy poverty of the sub-regions. Policies that will lead to the expansion of the manufacturing sector run into lack of electricity. When electricity or where electricity is available, we have a problem of reliability and the power supply for commercial and industrial purpose. There are many power outage within the different countries, where, for instance, we can observe one time power outage per month. In Central Africa, it's on average 10.8 times more, and it lasts about 9 hours each. That leads many firms to rely upon costly generators running with diesels to provide electricity for their businesses. This leads to higher production costs and higher emissions. So that leads us to our work. There is a need to find the way of increasing energy access to the population of the sub-region, and in particular, electricity access. It is well known that in this context, planification is fundamental. There is a need to carefully plan the different policies in order to increase the electricity access and in the sub-region. That means management strategies that will take into account the energy supply and demand associated policies and investment decisions. And make sure that those decisions are consistent with global goal of sustainability. However, this exercise is particularly difficult in the developing countries setting because of the lack of data, lack of reliable data and appropriate models. We first decided to use the LEAP, the Long Range Energy Alternatives Planning System. Why? Because this is a tool which is pretty flexible, is user-friendly, scenario-based, and it integrates energy and environment model building tool. It has been developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute. It's free for use, and the flexibility approach to modeling make it easier, the replicability easier. Timeline goes from medium to long term. We have annual time stepped and unlimited number of years. The model allowed, as I said, environmental characteristics modeling. The geographic applicability goes from local to national or regional. The scope, of course, is included energy demand, energy supply, resources, environmental loadings, cost-benefit analysis, and also non-energy sector emission can also be taken into account, considered. But most of those aspects are optional, bringing me back to the flexibility of the tool, of the model, of this modeling tool, and the fact that is well suited to the African context, and particularly to this Central African sub-region. In the energy demand section, we have a hierarchical accounting of energy demand activities levels multiplied by energy intensities. You can choose, you have a choice of methodologies to use. Energy conservation, simulation of any energy conservation sector, conversion solid sector can be used, electric generation, transmission and distribution, etc., etc. The electric system dispatch is based on electric load duration curves, exogenous and endogenous modeling of capacity and expansion. Energy resources, the model, the platform of the tool allows to track requirement, production, sufficiency, imports and exports. We can add land area-based accounting for biomass and renewable energy resources as well. We have a possibility to account for cost, all system cost, And again, the environment aspects can be taken into account. This is the calculation flow. We have to input demographics and macroeconomics variables data for the demand, and we have the possibility to account for the statistical differences. Transformation analysis can be done. Stock changes can be taken into account, and of course, resource analysis. I already said non-energy sector emission can be also considered. On my left side, we have this option to load the environmental aspect of the economy is considered, and the integrated cost benefit also can be taken into account, or we can make a cost benefits analysis. And this leads to environmental externalities. This leads to be able to see, account for, and consider, investigate the environmental externalities of the economy under analysis, under study. On this particular model, the LEAP Central Africa model, we consider the final energy demand and transformation sectors, primary and secondary energies consumed in all Central African countries, the 11 countries. The period of the study runs from 2020 to 2050. The main component of the model used here is population size, the economic growth, structural change, the improvement of energy efficiency, and renewable fuel switching. We consider also 5 NU sectors: residential, agriculture, services, industry, and transport. The energy consumption system considered is the power generation sector, the transmission and distribution sectors, and each level comprises the process of conversion and the output. For each power generation technology type, information on endogenous and exogenous capacity, the historical production, capital cost, and fixed and variable operation and maintenance costs are considered. Process efficiency also, reserve margin, dispatch rule, lifetime of the plant are also used. The emission abatement and energy saving potential can also be assessed by comparing the result of a different scenario for the entire study period of any year. But at this stage of the study, we haven't been able yet to go to this last stage. The economic variable here consider and their source. The economic variable consider a real economic per capita income growth, sources from IMF, the sectorial value added from the UN Statistic Division, value added variable for industry, agriculture, transport, and services. Demographic data are used, the total population, population growth rate, and urbanization from the World Population Prospect. The number of households and the size of each household are based on the World Urbanization Prospect, the 2019 version. Energy data here are from energy database, inner data from 2020, and the World Development Indicators. We have considered two scenarios, the business as usual, and we start modeling renewable energy policies, planned or already implemented for climate change mitigation objective in the sub-region. The energy and climate policies are associated with an economic development that will follow the past trends, the continuation of development of technology and science progress, We also consider a smooth development of urbanization and industrialization, and a gradual development of the transport sector with population growth rate, urbanization, and income progress. So this is the result of the final electricity demand by country. We can see that from 2019 is a historical part of the results. I'm just disregard it. From 2020 to 2015, there is an increase of the overall electricity demand in the sub-region as well as by country. It is expected that it will increase by almost 5 times by 2015, boosting the figure from about 47 terawatt hour in 2021 to 216 terawatt hour in 2015. The sub-regional consumption is and will be dominated by Angola and the DRC, which will account for about 32 and 28% respectively. Cameroon will account for nearly 25% of the sub-regional total final electricity demand by 2050. And the remaining 15% of the overall regional electricity consumption will be divided among the 9 other countries. This is the final electricity demand by sector and by country, 2020 against 2015. It is projected that until 2050, the industry sector, due to its expected growth in the coming years, will outpace the residential sector. It's not really visible here as a total by country. You can see that on the 2020 graph, residential sector demand is higher for almost all the countries. But in 2050, the industry sector demand will outpace the residential sector. Industry will account for more than half of the total electricity demand then by 2013, moving to 2050. The industry sector will be followed by the service sector. Nevertheless, and to go back to this figure, and the total energy, the final electricity demand will not be met. And this can be justified, proved by this graph, which is the electricity generation sector, presented here by share of input fuels. We can see that the total electricity generation by 2050 will be about 120 something terawatt hours. We can also note that most of the production from now going to 2050 will still be composed by large hydro and oil. And those are existing oil turbines. We didn't model any additional new oil turbine. Only the existing one has been considered, as well as the coal. The natural gas will complete the rest of the electricity generation in the sub-region. It can also be seen that this generation will double from 2020 to 2015, from 122 terawatt in 2020, from about 56 million of, from about 56 terawatt in 2020 to 122 terawatt by 2050. This production, this electricity generation, even if it is increasing, it will be less than the required or the demand by 2050. Indeed, if we go back to this figure, we can see that the total energy demand will stand at about 2050 by 2050. Will stand by 250 by 2050. And the electricity generation, considering the current generation space, it will only stand at 120 something terawatt. So it will be unmet demand by 2050, meaning that the electricity demand will still be, the electricity production generation will still be low by 2050 to meet the demand requirement for consumption for social and productive uses.
Sorry, Nadia. You have 2 more minutes to wrap up.
Okay, sure. This is the supply side and renewable energy scenario that I was saying that I try to model it. Quickly, you can see that, okay, this is the true comparison. This is the two figures presented at the same time. You can see that it hasn't changed a lot. This is because the current renewable energy policies of the sub-region are based on large hydro and biomass. And moving forward, those policy, renewable energy policy will not make any difference currently. So to conclude, the preliminary results show that we will encounter an increase of electricity demand by 4% by 2050. But it will be some shortages of supply and emission. Those are preliminary results that didn't presented by low emission of greenhouse gases. It can also be noted that the current pro-thermal electricity generation model will not allow the achievement of universal electricity access in the region, as the projected demand will remain unmet. In addition, the current projects which seek to promote hydro and biomass mainly as renewable energy resources will fail to reach the objective of sustainable electrification of the region, and need to speed up, of course, investments, human capital development, etc. And mainly those investments should be targeted towards the development of solar, wind, and small hydro resources rather than the large hydro currently projected. Next steps of the modeling work is to refine the data use, try to have better or better proxies, included variable on prices in order to account for the cost-benefit aspects, to analyze the cost-benefits of this business as usual model, or even the project or new policy that we would like to model. We will also include and develop the environment aspects of the model, emission mitigation, abatement, etc. And model more ambitious renewable energy policies, as I said, small hydro, solar, wind, and including variable on prices will allow us to analyze the cost benefit aspect of this ambitious renewable energy policy modeling. On that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this very interesting insights. So now we will turn to the discussion. So as usual, you can raise your hand or use the chat to ask Nadia questions. Maybe to let you prepare your questions, I have one short question. I was quite astonished in that in the baseline, there is almost no development of wind and solar. And you mentioned that actually the policies were not oriented towards these electricity sources. But at the same time, we see that the production costs for these power generation technologies are decreasing a lot over time. So I was wondering whether it was because the production started from very low that we didn't see that in the graph, or was it maybe because hydro is very much competitive in the Central African region that we don't see this uptake of wind and solar?
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have started sharing. I wanted just to show you the graph we are talking about. And you can see we do have some solar. Wind a little bit less because we don't have a lot of wind potential in this sub-region. But you can see that in green, we have some solar above orange, above the natural gas part. And it is, as you said, so small or low so far that we can barely see it. And the baseline just modeling, now this is the renewable energy. Yeah, but it's mostly the same. Here, we're just modeling the current going forward policies. So we didn't impact any, we didn't bring any policy of increasing solar, for instance. So, so far it's low, and it will continue being low if nothing is done, no matter the decrease of the current price of solar or wind materials.
Thank you. Victor, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Nadia. Very interesting presentation. I had a question regarding the assumptions or maybe the scenarios that you could consider about market integration, because probably you assume that there is some cross-border transmission, and well, that's very conditional on the existence of interconnectors. These are usually very costly. You need to build them in one go. They're costing the billions of dollars, and that's always can be subject to political motivation. So maybe I was curious whether you considered how the cost of the system might evolve depending on whether the markets are integrated or not, etc. Thank you.
I suggest that we take also Wolfgang's question together, and Nadia can respond afterwards.
Nadia, thanks. I mean, it's I think quite interesting for people from OECD countries to see these challenges Africa is facing with providing power supply. My question is, I mean, I've seen that a lot of those hydropower projects in Africa have been very, very large, and they take a decade or so at least to be realized. And in your projections, I rather see some continuous increase in the power. So did you consider existing projects which are being built or planned, and when they come basically then into operation, or how do you construct basically this outlook for hydropower?
Nadia, please.
Okay. On the cross-border transmissions, it has been taken into account, at least data on the number of the quantity of traded energy between the different countries of the sub-region has been taken into account. Now, what I need and what I said moving the next steps is to also enter the data on cost that will allow to give a better view of what is happening. And also maybe this can be another ambition to see the exchange or trade of energy between the sub-region as a whole and the other African countries, and even some European countries, if there is any. I don't know at what extent I will have data to do so, but this is something that I can look at and that can make the model maybe more interesting or more accurate at least. But we do have a pool, a Central African pool, and the different traded energy of exchange of energy are made through this pool. And we are able to modeling those aspects through the sub-regional power pool. But cost is still challenging. And I hope that the next step, I will be able to integrate the cost aspect. For the hydro projects are being considered the existing planned projects that will come into life by 2050, and only those are been has been modeled so far. The projected one, but not sure that it will be effective by the end of the projections, are not being considered. But that include very large projects, and like the one in the DRC. And maybe this is why it is leading us to those big number of large hydro overtaking everything. But the region, even by at the country level, are depending a lot on the large hydro resources so far. The ambition or the objective of the UNETA is also to model project the increase of other renewable energy, small hydro and solar in particular. And this will be the next step to see where those ambitious policies can lead us.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I think we are running out of time, so please join me in a round of applause for Nadia's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So this was our final presentation for this session on baseline development. So I would like to thank every presenter for the very interesting perspective, both very concrete and let's say based on regional and country level information to global perspective, global macroeconomic perspective. So it was very interesting. So I wish you all a very good GTAP conference and wish to see you again in the next couple of days. So goodbye and thank you very much to all presenters.